again. I am Ryan William O'Hara. I'm a Senior Customer Success Engineer at CircleCI. You can email me at ryanohara@circleci.com. So today's topics, we're going to do a migration overview, some common gotchas, and a general migration Q&A. But please feel free to just ask questions at any time. I will stop intermittently to answer some questions. I got one right now, but I'm going to hold off a little bit, and I'll try and answer a few at the same time. So let's see. So CircleCI 2.0 is the future. This is a quote. This is my own quote. That is cheating. I acknowledge that, but I promise it's true. So there's some links on the left-hand side there. You can get to the Sunset 1.0 page from the link in the UI if you're running 1.0 builds in a project, or you can get there from our homepage. Then we have some great migration documentation as well. I only included 2 of the actual migration documentation links, but we have a lot, so definitely go check that out. From that migration page, you can actually get to this config translation. So we have a CircleCI config generator, and we have an API endpoint. Oh, sorry. The generator actually just hits the endpoint, and it will also create a branch for you. It'll create the config for you. It's not a fully fledged out config or anything. It's just a template from which to go from, but it is very convenient. I recommend highly to open a branch, run builds frequently, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the first step really for migrating is that you want to choose an executor. So by default, we want to assume that you're going to be using the base Docker executor, but that is not necessarily the case. Then we have the Mac executor, and we have the machine executor. So if you needed full root access, if you need to build a Docker image, then you don't want the base Docker executor necessarily, but we do also have the remote Docker executor as well. So if you were on the base Docker executor, you could spin up the remote environment and you can build over there. There's some limitations, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But the config translation endpoint, it's a really good start, but it's really not perfect. It does not use best practices. So the idea that we put into the place here is that you want to move from 1.0 to 2.0, and you have never seen 2.0, and you really just need to get your build running on 2.0. You'll get to a working state using it. It might not be green right away, but you can get to a working state. The thing to keep in mind is that it uses our enormous Ubuntu image, and that is not best practice. It's just our idea of, hey, this has everything installed in it that you probably could need, so here's a good starting point. Overall, you're definitely going to want to pick a Docker image if you're not just building images yourself. You want to pick one that has like your language tools in it. If you're using Ruby with Node, we provide convenience images that makes that pretty straightforward, similar with Python and such. And if you need any combination, we do have a Docker file wizard in our CircleCI public repository or organization. Docker file wizard, something that my team works on. So if you have any requests for that, please feel free to let me know. And there are a lot of things installed in that Ubuntu image. It is colossal. Like, you really don't want to pull that down. I don't remember how many gigabytes it is, but it is more than you want by an order of magnitude. So pick your own image and go from there for sure. So then after you have your executor, your Docker image, that kind of thing sorted out, the next thing is migrating over the actual project, all the commands, the environment variables, all that stuff. The services you need, like Postgres is kind of an applied thing in 1.0. MySQL and Postgres are just running by default. So it won't be listed in your services section, but most people tend to need a database to run their tests, so just kind of keep that thing in mind. One gotcha that we won't be talking about later, but I'll mention now, is that there is no socket file for these services. So that's a common misconception, that you need to actually connect to it over TCP. We're sharing localhost, so it doesn't actually allow you to connect to the .sock file. So just be aware of that. You pretty much just need to define an environment variable or put it in your configuration. It just kind of depends on specifically what you're doing. But collecting the commands and the variables from the UI is a really easy step to miss or not do properly. There are in 1.0, there's the section in the UI to store commands. And so you can take those commands out, put it in your 2.0 config, because they won't run otherwise. And then there's the ones that inference runs for you. So that was really the crutch of 1.0. That was the whole point, was that inference was fantastic and did everything on your behalf. The downside was that we made all the assumptions for you, picked all the versions of all the services and everything. And it was less than ideal when we pushed updates. So 2.0 fundamentally addresses that, and you can even pin your Docker image to a specific SHA to make sure it never ever changes short of a repository being deleted. There are some certain things that you're going to miss. You don't have to migrate the environment variables from the UI per se, because they will be imported automatically into your 2.0 build as they were on 1.0. But there's certain ones in the inference that you'll miss, such as rack end or Rails end, because we automatically export that for Ruby projects to be tested. And if you miss that, you're going to get some funny errors and feel really silly when you forgot to just run testing. And again, just remember to do this in branch. You never want to cowboy this kind of thing in master. That would be worst case scenario. That's a nightmare. I am having trouble wrapping my head around the thought of even doing that. But if you have any silly syntax issues in your YAML, you know, you missed a pipe or something, you missed a space, like you'll catch it really early. But assuming that your YAML is always correct, which would be nice, you're still going to hit some technical errors. You know, like I mentioned, the sock file, like you're going to migrate everything over and you missed that you just have to tell MySQL to connect over TCP and not to use the socket. So just run a lot of builds. I mean, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Like that's the whole point of CI, is to just let your builds fail so you know what's going on. You can't run workflows via the API yet. That's coming very soon. You can run 2.0 builds via the API. So that's sometimes a good option to iterate quickly. One thing I do want to mention though, if anyone's running Ubuntu 12.04, please start upgrading now. I have seen some projects that were really smooth upgrades, and I've also had some projects that took literally 6 months to migrate just because, you know, the dependencies changed. We're no longer on Apache 2.2, we're on 2.4, the config changed, etc. There's just a lot of things. Some things have been EOL'd entirely upstream, so you want to find like the new, the thing that supersedes that. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind when migrating from such an old distro and such. So you want to give yourself as much time as you can. So I'm going to go ahead and answer some questions now. So one question we have here is, how do we maintain builds across different jobs in a workflow? Or do you not? We've had issues persisting, say, node modules and persisting workspaces. So my personal thought on node modules is that I want to cache it. I want it to be accessible for the next build. I have absolutely no faith in the NPM registry being accessible when I do NPM install. I have fairly good faith that it would be accessible for like Bundle or Composer, but even still, I mean, there was a Composer outage like yesterday, so it's not perfect. Caching those things is ideal because then you can reference it again in the future. And I'll talk a little bit about some private images, but mostly you shouldn't have to worry too much about persisting things across jobs. I feel like if you're running into issues with that, you're frequently missing something. A common question I get that's kind of a misconception is trying to persist your Docker image across your workflow. That doesn't really work out well. Some people try and like Docker save it to the disk and then persist that via the cache or workspaces. That's not a good idea. That was kind of the 1.0 way, which was really a big motivation to build 2.0. So you don't really want to do that per se. A lot of people actually overcomplicate things with workflows, and you can end up with a faster, depending on your use case, faster, more reliable build, just build your Docker image, just test your Docker image, run your whatever you need just in one single job instead of actually leveraging workflows. You could still have just one job in workflows and it's fundamentally the same thing, but switching jobs does add some time overhead, so you have to make sure it's worth it. If you're gonna build a Docker image and then push it up and then fan out into like a high parallelism environment and then maybe fan back into one to aggregate your code coverage, I'd recommend pushing your Docker image up and then using workspaces for the code coverage to aggregate that at the end and save it as an artifact. I hope that addressed your question. If it didn't, feel free to ask another question. So another question is, are there better ways to get Circle CI to succeed in checking out? We've had issues with PRs being picked up for private repos, and unfollow and re-add the project advice is getting unwieldy for so many repositories. So if you have PRs with forked repositories, you're probably going to have an issue with the forks. You're going to have to add that to the the system manually. The only issue I'm really aware of checking out is if you cache your source cache, then you could potentially have some issues if you force push. That's usually the biggest one. If you rebase or anything, you're going to run into some issues with that. Is there a YAML linter? There is. It is not perfect yet. It doesn't fully respect workflows, and there are some things that you could include in there that would be invalid, but if it's not a valid syntax, how do I word this? So if you put in a key that we're not looking for, we will ignore that key, but it might just be a typo of a legitimate key. So just kind of things to keep in mind. We are working on improving it, but it's mostly just for a 2.0 config, not a workflows config. So just keep that in mind. Is there a way to rerun CircleCI 2.0 builds in Circles 2? It appears that you can only rerun with SSH. So you're referring to the workflows UI. So in workflows, we've removed the rerun option from the job itself because we were having some issues with workspaces and some other confusion. So you have to go to the workflow itself to be able to rerun it without SSH. So you get the option to rerun the entire workflow or just rerun from just the failing ones. So it's not the worst thing in the world since it is just one extra click, but it's at least on our roadmap to address. We want that to be a little more seamless. What's the best way to make a Docker image available between jobs? Oh, hey, I just said that. So yeah, I would definitely build it and push it up. You can tag it with an environment variable and you can just prefix it with like temp or testing or something so it doesn't step on your official Docker images. One concern I heard was that they don't want their tags to be all cluttered in Docker Hub. I don't really ever load the Docker Hub UI, to be honest, but it is a fair concern. I don't really have a great fix for that other than to delete things on like a cron job in a workflow because we do support cron jobs now. But that's really the best I have for that today. If you want to open a discuss thread, we might get a good discussion going though. So some gotchas. Each run that you're going to specify, each command section, each block, each run is a different shell. So anytime you export environment variables or you source something or you modify an environment variable, that does not persist to the next shell. If you do want it to persist, you need to put it into this bash env variable that I can't necessarily pronounce super well with the $, but it is written in the slide. So if you were to echo things that export variables in there, it will automatically be sourced when bash opens up the shell. This is not true for SH. If you use Alpine, this is not going to work. That's kind of the gotcha with using really small, fast images. Now you don't get bash. And Ubuntu and Debian fonts. This is one of the things I encountered actually migrating from 12.04. One of the many pains was that Ubuntu 12.04 and Debian anything do not see eye to eye on fonts. Ubuntu has very specific fonts. So if you're exporting any images, PDFs, anything like that, where that you are actually testing on, and anything has to be pixel perfect, you're gonna want to use the same operating system. So it's unfortunate, but most of our images are based on Debian. We only extend the official Docker Hub community images. We aren't building ours from scratch. We just add on top. And the community has pretty much decided for most languages that Debian's a better option than Ubuntu at the moment. So just keep that in mind that if you do need Ubuntu 16.04 or something, you're probably better off building your own image. Pros and cons of that, you're not going to get many cache hits. You're going to get mostly cache misses. So you definitely want to keep your image slim, but all just things to keep in mind. And then of just an interesting thing that some people don't realize right away, I've seen it fail a lot of tests, is in 1.0, you can just tell us what time zone you want. In 2.0, you can still do that. You just have to define it as the TZ environment variable, and your system will respect that. But if you're using service containers like Elasticsearch, Postgres, Mongo, anything like that, you need to define that environment variable on each one. Otherwise, your systems aren't going to see eye to eye all the time. It's not an immediately obvious thing from a lot of the test failures I've seen that have suffered from that. So just be wary of changing the time zone. UTC is often okay. Depends on you though. So how do I run only a command for a given condition? I get this question all the time, and the answer is just bash if statements. You can do a lot with bash, and it's fair, not everyone is fully familiar with bash, but you're definitely going to want to implement a lot of bash logic into your 2.0 config if you're doing anything that's really fancy. We do have some support for conditionally running things, and we're also looking at adding more support for that. And we're also adding orbs, which is going to be things that are going to be like a pre-configured config that you can pull in. None of that's perfect yet. We're working on fledging that out as soon as we can. But in the meantime, bash workaround. Stack Overflow is going to be your friend. I/O can be slow is something that has really burdened us a lot. We've tried different file systems, and right now we're using AUFS. We're really getting the best performance with I/O, CPU, everything pretty much. The contention's still on the I/O, unfortunately, depending on the project. So this doesn't really impact most projects, in my opinion, but from what I've seen. But certain projects are really database intensive, or they're creating a lot of small files, you're compiling something. Those kinds of things can often see a performance decrease from 1.0. And the solution is frequently to run things in shared memory. So things to be aware of with that is that like Ruby gems don't really want to run in shared memory. I think a few do, but there's a lot that do not. So the fix is then that you would check out your project into dev/dev/shm/project, for example, and then you could install your bundle dependencies elsewhere and then symlink it in. So the dependencies are technically on the disk. Your project's not. Most of it's running in RAM, and everything's a little bit faster. We offer RAM variants of our databases so that you can run things in memory. And that offers a really, really big boost for the apps that suffer from the I/O contention. Keep in mind, though, if you're running MySQL and Friends in memory, you might need to allocate more memory to your build overall. So I mentioned this briefly with building Ubuntu images, that your image won't be cached on every run of the job. If you're building your own image from scratch, you're probably never really going to get a cache hit. We use Nomad to delegate our jobs, and where we stand today is that Nomad doesn't really care where your cache is. It just wants to give you a healthy server with enough resources to run your build. So if you use our convenience images, you have a far better chance of actually hitting the cache instead of missing it. That'll speed up the build a lot. 2 seconds to get the image versus 40. But it really is out of your control at this point. So it's something that we want to look into address, but not something we can fix in the short term. Another gotcha is don't use the latest. It's tempting. There are even some good use cases of doing it, but I guarantee you using latest will break your build eventually. It might be fine for 3 months, but then it will break and you will be sad. We previously used the latest Node modules, Node version, NPM and Node. We were pulling in the latest version for a while into our convenience images, and we realized that's not a good idea. You probably shouldn't trust latest of anything. So we're going with latest LTS now, which isn't the worst idea. But again, you can always pin to a specific SHA of a Docker image to make sure it never, ever changes short of the repository actually getting nuked. So I got some new questions I'm going to address here before we move on to the next gotcha slide. Actually, I might be out of gotchas. We'll find out. Is there an easy way to migrate from using the Circle keychain to match for Fastlane multiple apps? That's a really fantastic question. It's a little bit cumbersome. I don't know if there's an easy way per se, and that's definitely not in my prime toolbox of using. I'm not super familiar with Fastlane, just kind of vaguely in solving some of these issues, but I suspect there's going to be a clever way to solve this. I don't think there's going to be an easy way, unfortunately. Not today, at least. What changed between 1.0 and 2.0 with regards to the Circle compare URL? I don't think anything. I can't think of any changes we made to that. The only real environment variables that changed were we added a bunch for workflows, but we also removed Circle artifacts and Circle test results. The reason being because we were creating those directories for you and then automatically uploading them. In 2.0, I mean, you can define those variables and create them and then upload them. But by default, you can just tell us what to upload. It doesn't have to be in temp or anything specific. It could be anywhere. I'm not really sure about the compare URL. If you're seeing something, though, feel free to open a support ticket. I'd be happy to take a closer look for you. Next question. I'd like to test locally with the Circle CI CLI, but the checkout code step of the Circle CI build takes several minutes. Could that be because I'm using the large base Ubuntu image? I would assume so. I don't have full context here. I'm assuming that it's the checkout with the Ubuntu image because that thing's probably like 17 gigabytes or something monstrous. Like I said, it's colossal. Like, you really don't want to use that image. this is a great example. If you're running builds locally, you don't want to build that image. That's going to be nothing but pain. But I mean, to be fair, the Ubuntu image is a good patch for certain projects I've seen. If you build like quarterly and you really don't care about the project very much and you can afford it to take whatever minutes, then it's fine. But if you're going to run it locally, that's, well, I can't recommend that. Don't be a masochist. It's not worth it. And you feel free to open a ticket. I think it would be just the image size though. So we'll move on to the next slide. If anyone else has questions though, please feel free to let me know. So commands only run in the first image listed under Docker. So I've seen some people try to stack like Python, Ruby, Node, AWS, whatever it might be. That would be magical if we could just reference the binaries from all of them, but commands run the first one. So the second, the third, the fourth, and the Docker executor, those are just the service ones. You can specify the command to run, but we're still going to run that through an entry point as a regular service container. You can't have the run steps actually run in those. It would be really nice, and I would love to see that accommodated in the future, but that's just not a thing right now. So the machine executor. The machine executor is a magical world that you can get yourself in a lot of trouble with, or it can make things a lot easier for you. It depends on what you're doing. If you're using Docker Compose, the machine's awesome. You can just Docker Compose up. Docker Compose is installed. Docker is installed and running. You can even utilize Docker layer caching. It's not great if you want to use Bundle. If you want to use Composer, if you want to do something with Scala, like this is a bad option. In theory, I mean, realistically, we have RVM installed. So in theory, you could use RVM to do your things. The downside is that you have to source the RVM things on every run step, or make everything a single run step, because it's going to be sourced the whole time. It depends on what you're doing. I have seen some use cases where doing that is more efficient to just build a Docker image. The specifics are kind of confusing, but you have to weigh your options, basically. And if it's going to be more straightforward for you to just use RVM, especially, I think the best use case is if you're using some Ruby version that I haven't heard of in 4 years or something. The machine's probably a faster option. I doubt you're going to get an updated Docker image unless you build it yourself, and then there's no cache hits, so it's really what you want. But the machine, if you're building Docker images and you don't need to actually compile anything with Ruby or some language-specific utility, I recommend using the machine. You're going to see half the time overhead, because on Docker, the base Docker executor, if you were to build a Docker image, you need to first pull down your images, then you need to allocate the remote environment. That remote environment is the same as the machine executor. So you can just cut out that middleman of pulling down the image first. Again, depends on your use case. I've seen a lot of great use cases where they definitely want to build something, compile something in the base Docker executor, and then build the Docker image in the remote machine. It's totally fair. One thing to keep in mind is full root access is available on the machine. You have passwordless sudo and everything is fantastic and magical. The downside to the Docker executor is pretty much no networking debugging utilities will work, because you can't get a socket. You can't do much. Like if you want to run an MTR report, you're going to need the machine for that. Don't define path with path. This is one of my favorite gotchas, because we don't presently interpolate environment variables. As much as I really, really want us to, there are some hiccups with doing that with the way everything's implemented on our end. So right now, if you were to, in your config, just specify path is defined as, /bin : path, you accidentally just broke your path. The only thing that's going to be in your path is /bin, because path will be defined verbatim to what you put in there. We will not interpolate those variables. So the fix for this is to use the bash end file, like I mentioned earlier. You just echo export the path, /bin path, then it will export appropriately. Again, don't try that on Alpine. You will run into pain and suffering. So here's some thoughts for you. Oh, I got a question. I'm just going to answer that first. Is it empty in 2.0? It used to work in 1.0. Is there a good way to access the SHA-1 of the previous build? The SHA-1 of the previous build. That is a really fascinating question. So in a PR, I'm pretty sure the compare URL is the same. I'm pretty sure you can technically get that out of there. But the thing with workflows because the previous job technically could have the same shop. So I don't know specifically on that. That is a really good question. You should definitely open a support ticket or post on Discuss so we can get a conversation started about what's actually happening. That's a really good question. So things you can consider when using Circle CI 2.0 is you can match production. There are bugs out in software with every piece of software, and sometimes your specific commit that you just pushed will unveil that bug in Apache, Nginx, MySQL, Memcache, whatever it might be. If it just doesn't play well together, finding out in CI and not in production is an amazing amount of leverage you have on fixing this problem versus breaking things for your customers. So, or at least your users, but you can match production. So I recommend doing that. I mentioned Docker Compose earlier. I've seen a lot of people have really, really great results with Docker layer caching and just Docker Compose, where they spin up their machine, their cache is there, Docker's running, they can just Docker Compose up, everything's good, and their Docker Compose config is structured to just run your tests for you. Super straightforward. You can pin everything to specific versions and everything that you're using in production. It's a super fantastic peace of mind exercise there. So speed versus reliability. I just got another question. I'm going to hold off on that for a little bit. If anyone else has a question, feel free to add it to the queue and I'll get to it at the end of the slide. So speed versus reliability. If you want your builds to be super fast, I have some cool hacks that can get you super fast builds using private Docker images especially. You can take an image, you can bake in your dependencies. I know bake in is a silly phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway. But you can bake in your dependencies. You can bake in all of your node cache, your bundle cache, your source cache, all of that can be accessible for you right there. So when we cache things on our end using save cache or store cache, we use S3. I believe the same is true for workspaces. So since we use S3, it can be slow. I know some people don't like the hard truth that S3 can be slow, but it can be. Docker registries are lightning fast though in comparison. So if you actually do build the private image with your things installed, your cache will be accessible much faster. And of course, you then bypass the errors of node modules and NPM registry issues, but also, Compose or other things. Everything crashes at some point or another. And if your node modules are cached and version controlled in private Docker images, you're never going to lose it. You can even Docker CP it out of the image to be local again. I don't know how many of you were around when that when that user on the NPM registry deleted all the projects and broke all of the node projects in the world. Probably plenty of you were there for that, and it was horrible. So this kind of helps mitigate that. And this also helps mitigate a little bit of DNS outages. Obviously, it's not perfect, but we've had some DNS outages in the world in the past, and maintaining an Etsy host file with all of the IPs of all the things probably isn't ideal. So caching things in Docker sounds pretty good. It's the best I can offer, that's for sure. So file systems are different between systems. We are running AUFS in 2.0. We're running BTRFS in 1.0. So on 2.0, AUFS is the prominent thing. We tried BTRFS, it didn't work out with CPU. We want to try Overlay 2 probably in the future. I don't think we're there yet. So things are in flux, but the AUFS causes some hiccups for some Ruby projects specifically. It has the potential to cause it for other things too, but it's mostly notable for Ruby projects. They have the potential to load files in the wrong order. And I've had some questions about how do you debug this? I don't really have a great answer to that, unfortunately. It's kind of a tedious, good luck kind of process. Very carefully is my favorite answer, but I can see where that's kind of a rude answer. I've been in the trenches with people to debug this. It's pretty much just you're missing a requires. So I guess the best advice I can give you is to go through your stack trace and see where things stopped being accessible, because you're probably just missing a requires, which often isn't terrible to fix. One other thing to consider, last thing I really have that's just kind of a fun thought for you, outside of just defining your shell as Python and running arbitrary Python via the API, is that the base Docker executor, you can use extra large containers. I mean, you need to get this verified with your CSM and everything, and your account manager, but once you're whitelisted for resource classes, you can use extra large containers with 8 CPU cores and 16 gigs of RAM. So if you're feeling extra clever, again, this doesn't work for everything, it's just when you're feeling extra clever, You can allocate that remote Docker environment to get another 2 CPU cores remotely and 8 gigs of RAM remotely. So, I mean, these do not add together to just use 24 gigs of RAM. That would be awesome, but that's not how that works. But you can run things remotely at the same time as you run things locally, and they're using completely different resources. So it's just a fun thing to think about, because there really is a lot of potential there. You can't mount volumes, and you can't connect directly to those instances that you spin up in the remote environment, but you can Docker CP your files over. If you do mount volumes, you're mounting it from the host of the remote environment. So you can, in theory, you can run privileged containers. You can modify the host however you see fit. That's all plausible. You just can't do the volume from the base Docker to that remote environment. You can't curl directly, but you can Docker exec a curl. So, I mean, there's some workarounds and some hacks, and it really depends on your use case. So I'll answer this question now. Currently, we are using GitHub integration with CircleCI 1.0. Where does Docker images come into play here? Okay, so right now you're running your images, you're running your tests in 1.0 in a huge Ubuntu image. So in 2.0, we offer convenience images. So if you're using Ruby with Node, you want to use the CircleCI/Ruby and then one of the Node variants. So you can see that on our Docker Hub page. We have all the versions there. It's, getting started with Docker isn't, it's scarier than it is difficult, because it's a new technology, and containerization, there's all these terms, flags, shortcomings, and all these things, but overall it's pretty straightforward. You just pick an image and then try and run your commands in it. Keep in mind there's no full root access. That's really the gist of it. I guess another thing to keep in mind is you're not running as the Ubuntu user in the new images, you're running as CircleCI. If you build your own image, you're probably running as root. Some things don't want to run as root, so watch out for that. I mean, Composer will just give you a warning. Pretty sure Postgres will just explode, so just keep that in mind. For basic implementation, do we just need to copy over build settings into the config.yaml? Yeah, pretty much. If you just scroll through, if you just load up the build in your UI and you just scroll through it, make sure you're not missing anything that is actually running, because you can see what has run. So if you go through, make sure you're not missing anything, you'll be pretty much good to go. I mentioned earlier on that we don't have to define MySQL or Postgres in the config. In 1.0, it's already running, so it's implied. But if you are leveraging a service like that, you definitely want to pull that in. Well, we are at full Q&A time now, so if anyone does have any additional questions, especially anything migrating specific, language specific, I can touch on. While people think of things in type, I'll just spew some words at you. So if you're using Scala, you're often going to hit an issue where your file names are too long. We have a solution for that. It's not something I can verbalize. It's really ugly because it's just a config tweak, but we have a fix for that, I promise. Java's going to run out of memory. In the base Docker executor, you can't check how many resources you have. I know you should be able to look at the C group, but you can't, so it's really frustrating. You have to take our word on how much we're actually allocating for you. Our UI is correct. We have vetted that thoroughly. It is correct, but you cannot manually verify it. I'm probably more frustrated by this than you are, I promise. It would be really great if I could log in and run like FreeTAC-M or DFTAC-H, but these things don't actually do what you hope they do. You're looking at the host, not the container. So here's a quick question. If you cache node modules, wouldn't you have to manually manage them? What happens when a new version is now dependent upon? Yes, exactly. So that is really the shortcoming, the speed versus reliability thing. So if you do cache your node modules in a Docker image, how often do you increment or change your dependencies? Because you're going to want to rebuild that Docker image when that happens. So what I always recommend is building your image on a cron job as often as you feel you're comfortable with. If you only update your dependencies quarterly, you could probably get away with just building a Docker image on a cron job every Sunday and be perfectly good to go. There's ups and downs, pros and cons of these things, and I'd be happy to discuss it further. If you do have specific pointed questions, feel free to email me about that. But definitely pros and cons. I just really like the peace of mind of having that. But I did have an interesting question at one point where if one dev goes off into a branch, they can't really use, like, to change dependencies or something structural like that. They can't really use the same cache. So then you get it takes a longer time for that dev's builds to run, but everyone else in the company would then have fast builds. So pros and cons. You really have to weigh those options. I'm kind of into boats, and one of the things that when you buy a boat, you need to consider, you can get price, comfort, or speed. You can get 2 of the 3. You can't get all 3. It's kind of the same with Circle CI jobs. You need to really just weigh the pros and cons. You can't get speed, reliability, simplicity, and all of the things all at once. You got to pick and choose what's actually important to you and your team. The doc suggests the machine executor might be separately paid in the future. While there are advantages of the machine, would you still recommend using the machine instead of building on a clean Ubuntu image? If you're building Docker images, yeah, 100%. If you need Ubuntu, I would go with the Docker image of Ubuntu. The docs probably do say that it might be premium in the future. As far as I know, it won't be. Maybe check with the salespeople, but it's been free so far. Our original plan over a year ago was to make it a paid thing, and we realized it didn't have to be with the way that it was all structured. So that might just be a lingering note in there. To fix Java, I'm assuming this is a typo of Gradle, running out of memory, will using Machine Executor help that? No, I think that's painful. You're going to want to, if you actually really do need more than 4 gigabytes of RAM, especially if you had more than 4 gigabytes of RAM allocated at 1.0, you're going to want probably like 8 gigs of RAM in 2.0. I don't think I've seen an Android build that can run in 4, for example. But we can allocate more if you talk to your account manager. But a lot of Java projects really just need you to specify environment variables to restrict how much memory it's using. You just have to pass the XSM and XMX args to Java JVM ops. I don't remember. There's my coworker Rose has a fantastic blog post on our site about how to handle Java issues. So if you just Google Java issues, Circle CI Rose, you will 100% find it, and it is amazing. There's a chart, all of the environment variables that would impact Java, why and when you would use them, and the priority they take. It's a fantastic thing. I can't recommend it enough. But with the nature of Java, if you're really hitting that cap, you probably just want a slightly larger container. Will a recording of this session be available? It will. We will make this available on YouTube in the very near future. So if you're watching this on YouTube. How are the tag and branch representations in the config.yaml changed with regards to 2.0? Fantastic. So by default, we ignore all tags that are pushed unless you explicitly tell us in the config to respect it. In 2.0, without workflows, you're pretty much doomed. But with workflows, you can actually add filters and branch support. So it's pretty much exactly the same like regular expression support syntax. It's just where it goes in the config is wildly different. So you'll definitely want to check out our workflows documentation just for the little snippet of the workflows section. But the filtering is pretty straightforward. One thing to keep in mind, though, is if you start filtering things on like only and such, you'll probably need to apply it to all the jobs in a given workflow, or you might have some unexpected consequences. Do you know why Git tags don't show up in the workflow tag? They don't? Wait, what? I'm pretty sure that the workflow itself would, at least. I might be misunderstanding the question. If your jobs aren't triggering on tags, that would definitely cause that. You'd have to explicitly tell us to build on the tags. But if you're pushing tag builds that aren't showing up in the UI, that's maybe you're filtering on a branch. They should definitely show up. Maybe open a support ticket. We can help you out with that. If you are having more issues with that. That sounds kind of out there. Happy to help for sure. Oh, we're always happy to help. We're not always available. We're always happy to help. So a lot of the things that I talk about gotchas wise, there's a huge list in our Discuss board, and there's the equal list in our blog. I think I'm technically the author on the blog and not on Discuss. Don't quote me on that. I think Fernando posted it on Discuss, but it's got some really good stuff in there that's kind of language specific and some things to keep in mind. Some other things random thoughts are you can run multiple Elasticsearch containers or Postgres containers, but I've seen a lot of use cases of wanting to run multiple Elasticsearch versions at the same time. You can actually name the container. So you can port overload by just giving it a name. So you can connect like one on localhost, the other could just be Elasticsearch, or whatever. You can call it ES24 or whatever floats your boat. So I just got confirmation. The YouTube video for this webinar will be available on Friday or Monday, so check back in then for sure. You can subscribe to our Circle CI YouTube channel and just get alerts when that happens. Another question: when will we be able to use commit tags? You just mean tagging your commit? Yeah, you can do that today, but we will ignore it by default. So without the workflow section to enable the tags, they will not run. You need to go in and allow things, and you can just, it's just regular expressions. You can just do dot asterisk, and it'll just, Excel, I guess, dash dot asterisk dash, but that'll be fine. It'll build all your tags at that point. It's, I guess, seeing these questions, I guess it's a little counterintuitive to build on tags, but as long as you tell us to build on tags, we absolutely will. So I have, I guess, I'll give it another minute for any new questions to come in, but then at that point, I guess I'll just call it. Again, I'm Ryan William O'Hara. I'm the Senior Customer Success Engineer, and you can email me at ryanohara@circleci.com. If you don't get any questions, then please just feel free to email me. I'm always happy to help. I might be a little overburdened with questions, emails, and such, but I'll get back to you. I do not ignore messages. It would eat me up inside if I did. ryanohara@circleci.com. That is correct. If you email Ryan it's going to a different Ryan. He'll probably also help you, to be fair, but it would be a different Ryan. Custom commit tag. Oh, that is a good question. So the question is, when could we use custom commit tags such as CI skip? That's a really, really good question. So right now, the only real option we have is kind of bash if statements, pretty much. You can still filter branches. I don't think you can filter on the commit itself. So I think you'd need to have some sort of bash if statement to maybe exit. You could just fail to build exit one. That wouldn't work for all use cases, but you could definitely put something into a commit message and then manually check that in your config to just abort the whole thing. We have support to stop the build wherever you run the command circle CI step halt, and we have more definitive plans to make that a bigger feature because that is fairly undocumented, but it is in my gotchas list I mentioned that's in our blog and discuss. That's a really good question. CI skip is definitely a change from 1.0. All right, if that's it, then I'm just going to call it. This is my dog, Roger. This is my doggo, Tax. So I hope everyone got to learn something. If not, just email me and I will learn you something. Have a great day, everyone.